Of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and a master's degree in Asian and African Studies with a specialization in Africa from El Colegio de México, with a thesis, The Traces of Rebellion, a historiographical review of the Mau Mau Rebellion. Between 2015 and 2017, he participated in the creation of the website To Learn Swahili by Colmex. He was in charge of continuing education for the University Program of Studies on Asia and Africa, UEA, from 2018 to 2022. He has participated in various colloquia at the UNAM and UAM on decolonization and armed rebellions in Africa. He also collaborates with the digital magazines Black Heralds and Rebellion. He teaches the subject of Sub-Saharan Africa from the 18th to 21st century at the Faculty of Philosophy and Letters. He has coordinated the diploma courses in Asian and African Studies since 2016. He also coordinated the course of Conflicts and Projections in the African Continent and is part of the authors of Coordenadas 2050 with African themes. Javier, welcome back to PUEA. It's very nice to have you here. Please, you have the use of floor.
Hello. First of all, thanks to the University Program of Asian and African Studies for the invitation. It's always an honor to be here again. I will talk about corruption, vaccines, and in African perspective. Talk about corruption in Africa, it's always problematic because the measures of corruption comes from Occident, comes from the Monetary International Fund and the World Bank. And this is always some kind of problems when you talk about democracy, corruption, development, because you have to have the colonial perspective, but with Occidental concepts. No, so corruption is always a problem for governmental institutions, and you have to search different corruption practices. No, just before this conversation, we were talking about corruption in the police teams, but we can also find corruption in times of crisis, corruption in conflict, corruption in one-party governments, corruption in a lot of perspectives. So when you talk about corruption in Africa, you have to talk about colonialism, but also you have to talk about traditional politics. Sometimes corruption comes with some traditional practices in politics. When you are doing something for someone, you are expecting that this person do something for you. No, so the public interest became the private interest, and this is when you are talking about corruption. For a lot of authors, corruption is a pathology of the democracy. Corruption is a pathology of the programs, of the structural programs from the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and it's when someone needs to keep something for themselves. No, normally are public funds, normally are funds for helping in times of crisis. That is what we will talk about. But it's also when the public server, or the person is secure that he will avoid justice. So the public interest comes to second place, and it will become a private interest. You will have conditions of impunity, and how does it occur, this impunity? We will also have themes about betrayal, responsibility, but it's also problematic to talk about betrayal because there is a fine line between corruption and incompetence. So it's always talk about betrayal, the no objective of searching the public interest, the public necessity, and it will become a complex and local matter. No, it's always you have to talk about corruption, but you have to talk about corruption in South Africa, about corruption in Zimbabwe, because it's always have a specific themes and specific practices. No, corruption so becomes a part of the democracy, becomes part of the pathologies of the democracy, where democracy is an obligation for some governments, principally South global government, no? And this idea of corruption becomes also a practice of neocolonialism and also a form of political power. It's with corruption that some governments retain power, that some governments became richer also, even if public health is in the line, no? And the responsibility of the people, the responsibility of the public server, it's always not the principal theme in these cases. So in South Africa, the first the first case of coronavirus was in March 15, 2020, and this became a problem. The government have to analyze with the National Institute of Communicable Diseases and some people that was also working in the AIDS pandemic. The scientists involved in AIDS were the scientists that were working with Cyril Ramaphosa, in this case, the actual president of South Africa, and Ramaphosa takes a different perspective than the one taken by Thabo Mbeki, Jacob Zuma, in the pandemic of AIDS. No, for Thabo Mbeki, for example, AIDS wasn't a big problem. He says in public talking that AIDS can become a curable disease with lemon, with vinegar. So Ramaphosa, he was a politic that became the politic that will finish the corruption in South Africa. So he started working very close to the scientifics. He made a national emergency. He closed the school. He closed borders. But also, these problems mark that South Africa, the government of South Africa, wasn't capable of helping their people, no? Wasn't capable of bringing public health, wasn't capable of bringing food for those who hasn't job, and they start buying beds to the private sector. They start buying also mobile clinics that they never paid to the private investors. So there start some practices of corruption. There start some practices in crisis that a lot of people were questioning where is the money. No, the National African Congress, Ramaphosa arrives to power after the killing in Marikana mines. No, and the National African Congress was in a public scandal about these mines, about the funds before and after Jacob Zuma. And Ramaphosa also didn't have the funds to work with the people, the funds to avoid the crisis. And after 2 or 3 months of the closing of borders, schools, private sectors, he started to open this. He started to open the schools, the borders. The scientific says that if the government didn't work closing the schools, borders, there will be around 230,000 people dead. No, and in April of 2020, Ramaphosa started opening again schools, business, making that a lot of people start getting the diseases, no? In mines, in coffees, in restaurants, in a lot of places, there start to be a lot of people dead, no? And Ramaphosa avoid the crisis. Ramaphosa tries to get the money. Ramaphosa tries to open all the business, in order to be richer, in order to the National African Congress also avoid the crisis. No, we have to think that the National African Congress is in power after the elections in 1994, when Mandela arrives to power, and they are keeping the power all the time. No, and there is the Communist Party. There is opposition, but the National African Congress is keeping the power all the time. And also the politics of Ramaphosa were very problematic because the first weeks he used tear gas, rubber bullets to avoid manifestations, to keep the people in their houses. He removed squatters, he removed homeless, he hit homeless, and sometimes the people in the streets were remove it without a solution, no? And this also marks the idea of corruption, no? The idea of corruption is not only getting richer, it's also avoiding the public interest, avoiding the idea of keeping safe the people, and also try to avoid the political scandals, try to keep in power, try to maintain the political power, to maintain also the violence in the hands of the states, in order to have a lot of things, no? We can see also in the closings a lot of people getting assassinated, no? Getting murdered. We can see people getting murdered in front of their childs because they don't want to return to their homes. We can see a lot of violence in the closings, and there we can find also practices of corruption. We can find also practices where the political power start to see their private interest in and know the public interest. No, where is the money in South Africa? Where is the money to keep the public health there? No, we can see that 70% of the care units and doctors are in private sector, and they are attending only 16% of the people in South Africa. And there is when the public health start buying beds, no? But they never question where this will stop the pandemic and what will happen when the public health start getting without money and they need to buy more and more and more beds. Imagine that Ramaphosa is opening everything against the recommendations of the World Health Organization. They purchase beds. They purchase beds for the private sectors. They purchase beds from the private sector, and there is no money. There is also no capacity for paying these beds. No. Ramaphosa started finishing the crisis of the pandemic, the hardest years of the pandemic, with around 20,000 people dead. But a lot of people is questioning the transparency in those numbers. No, this happened in a lot of global south countries. The numbers of the people, the numbers of infected people, it said that a lot of governments didn't have a lot of transparency in those numbers. No, there is people dead by pneumonia. There is a lot of people dead by other diseases caused by COVID-19. Also, we have to say that Ramaphosa, in those months when he closed everything with violence, also allows the public health sector to prepare for the COVID-19. No, but it also marked the weakness in the health system and the incapacity of the government to help the people. There were programs to help some business to pay their employees, but there is no money for these programs. There is not a lot of people getting this help. And we will see a lot of denial. We will see a lot of little practices of corruption by the police, by the politics, by the Minister of Health. We will see a lot of practices making the crisis worse, the crisis even worse. No, we have to think that in the crises, the government um, usually moves a lot of financial funds in order to help the people. No, but we can't see in South Africa where are the helps from the World Bank, where are the helps of the monetary institutions, where are the helps of other governments. We can see in South Africa a lot of funds that are disappearing in order to help the people. No, uh, Ramaphosa was a politic that will fight corruption, that will change the African National Congress, and this isn't happening. No, Ramaphosa was a union leader. Ramaphosa was also closer to Mandela, but then he started to see his benefits in the private sector. No, he arrives to power, I insist, after the Marikana massacre, and he was there also keeping the private sector, keeping without health insurance a lot of South Africans, and there is no clue about this fight against corruption. And we can see also in these years of the pandemic the inability to address basic economic help, to address health, and to address nutritional needs to the people. No. In March 5 of 2020 is when Ramaphosa started to open all the schools, the business, and we can see also an unequal access to the health sector. No, we can see in South Africa a very unequal society, that 10% of the people holds 86% of the wealth, and this is marked by racial lines. No, the apartheid isn't finishing even in 2023. We can see that the richest people in South Africa is white people, is people that is not interested in places like Soweto, no, in places that lives in another reality. Even though the government of South Africa thinks that they will rely in science in order to be the more prepared in the years of the pandemic in 2020, 2021, 2022, they start having problems with the mediums. They start to have problems with the necessity of the people. We can see also these kind of problems in Nigeria, for example, no, the Lagos massacre in 2020 with the movement #EndSARS, #EndSARS. We can see this kind of practices where the military police, the police, the yeah, all kinds of police is keeping being utilized by the political power in order to keep the people in their houses, even though there is a lot of people living with $1 diary, with a lot of economical problems. No, so the government of South Africa keeps near of the Center for Epidemiological Modeling and analysis, no? And also the National Institute of Communicable Disease. In March 2020, they said that this crisis will be with 87 to 351,000 deaths in all the pandemic. The problem with these two institutes is the numbers. No, we can see there is a lot of difference between 87,000 deaths to 351,000 deaths. The difference is how the government will respond to the crisis. No, and the government keeps very near to the 351,000 deaths. No, in March 50, sorry. They keep a lot of practices like direct income cash transfer, like firms with political connections were the only firms that get help for the public sector, no? And you can see, I insist, you can see the help to the people. You can see that the people were getting some kind of assistance during these years, no? Thinking that there is a lot of places that they don't have public services, that they don't have the capacity of maintaining the health recommendations during this crisis. No? We can also see bad testing problems. Ramaphosa was keeping confidence with their 28,000 community health workers that were going house to house, scanning people and making uh, some testings. No, the practice of testing during the AIDS pandemic was perfected during these years, no, the Thabo Mbeki and the Jacob Zuma years, but also the public health workers were working in bad conditions. They don't have the equipment necessary, they don't have the capacity, and we can find in the last months on the 2020 that 30,000 public health workers were infected and more than 1,000 died in the first year of the pandemic. They were buying mobile clinics in order to help people in their houses, no, the infected people in their houses, but we never see the payment of these mobile clinics. No, the private sector, the private finance sector, was keeping the idea that we can see transparency in the moving funds during the Ramaphosa government. And we can only see the incapacity of response during those years. The funds for help were clearly not enough for the people, but we can see that the World Bank, for example, give like $100 million to the Ramaphosa government, even though the Ramaphosa government didn't have the funds to help the people, didn't have the funds to give money, to give food to the people, and that's why they start to reopen, not even when the 2020 was finishing. We can see another examples. We can see also that the organized crime moves to help the people, and this is also some kind of practice of corruption because the state gives the responsibility of the public interest to the organized crime, and the organized crime start reparting help. We can see there in Somalia, we can see there even though here in Mexico, where the cartel of Golfo start helping the people when the government didn't respond in natural disasters. No. And this is how the organized crime holds the defense of the people. No, we can see also that in Zimbabwe, the Minister of Health, Obadio Mayo, was charged of criminal abuse because he used 60 million dollars, US dollars, to buy COVID-19 supplies without the public displacement of the government. No, but we can also see that the supplies that he bought with inflated prices in order also to keep some money. No, in Uganda we can see these kind of practices. In South Africa we see a lot of these kind of practices, buying supplies for COVID-19 to the public health sector, to the people, and not getting interested in the prices of these kind of supplies. No, we can also see that a lot of governments, sub-Saharan African governments, trigger large economic stimulus, but this stimulus keep only for the firms, the business, with relations with the political power. No? So, direct income cash transfers, we can see a lot of corruption risk in a lot of these countries. The problem is that the firms with political connections were the only ones that they're getting the helps, the direct income cash transfers in order to buy voters, to influence voters. The lack of data of beneficiaries of these funds, and this is an excuse because in the idea that you have to give the help very quickly, there is a lack of transparency, a lack of auditory to keep this kind of help. No? The trading and sharing influences and information. No? We can see that in South Africa, some functionaries buy actions in markets that they knew that there will be benefited by the COVID-19. No? And also unintended beneficiaries. No, we can see that these programs have an objective of some kind of socioeconomic people, no, of socioeconomic ranks, and in the urgency, we can see that there is a lot of people having these funds that they don't need to have. No, in Sierra Leone, we find the disbursement of 30% of the domestical source. There is improper procurement procedures. There is buying ambulances by inflated prices, and a slow response to the crisis. No, and this is also a practice of corruption. The slow response, even though you can find that the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, give a lot of money to these countries, and there is no response of the government. No, and also that the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund start questioning where is the money that I give you. No, even though they know that these governments will keep some of the money. No, uh, in order to conclude, we can think that after pandemic, there is an obligation of the governments to keep measures to prevent and combat corruption during crisis, but also all the time, no? Because the corruption became with violence, became with deaths, became with the lack of attendance of these public interests. And it's all for me. Thanks.
Thank you, Javier. The topic about corruption and COVID-19 is unquestionably a very interesting one. At the beginning of your presentation, I was also wondering how to address the corruption from an African perspective. How can we ask or question how are those governments tackling the corruption? Do we have the agency to do so? Is it different if we question it from the North or if we question it from Latin American countries? And when they try to solve the corruption problem, how is it different from the Euro-American strategies? You were raising the question, is corruption a neocolonialism strategy? Or is it part of the pathology of democracy? I will also add the question, is it a cultural issue? How could we solve it? But let's keep all these questions for the Q&A session. I'm also very happy to introduce today Gabrielle Robbins, who is presenting today the topic of securing against shortage, emerging African drug industries in the global pandemic era. Gabrielle Robbins is a PhD candidate in the History, Anthropology, Science, Technology, and Society program at the MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Her research examines the politics of health and freedom in highland Madagascar amid cascading ecosociological crises. Current projects focus on Madagascar's commercialization of a domestically produced COVID treatment, especially the negotiations of health, sovereignty, and industrial change which result from this pandemic response. At the broadest level, her research addresses the stakes of both global inequality and ecological breakdown for stable medicine access, and the creative solutions undertaken by the local communities and government initiatives to ensure health given such overlapping challenges. Gabrielle, we are very happy to have you here. Welcome, and you can use the floor.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for being here. And I appreciate that very generous introduction. I'm Gabrielle Robbins. I'm a PhD candidate at MIT. And today, on the topic of pandemic impacts to African society, I'll walk you through some of my research on African medical industries. First, I'll take us through some basics of drug production and general trends about pharmaceutical manufacturing on the African continent. And then I'll get more in depth with the results of my research from the island nation of Madagascar. And then we'll have a very productive time, I think, for Q&A at the end. And I'm just going to check that this works because does it? Yes, amazing. Okay, so this is a 101 on pharmaceutical manufacturing. This is basically the process of how to make necessary medicines. You combine an active pharmaceutical ingredient or an API, which is up here on the left, with a non-active ingredient or an excipient to yield various necessary finished pharmaceutical compounds. So pre-pandemic, this process was very distributed. For example, for anti-malarial medicines, active ingredients might be made in Madagascar and then shipped to India or China for further processing, from which finished pharmaceuticals or finished pills might be sent on to, say, Morocco, where they would then be distributed to other countries. So you have these extremely distributed global supply chains that applies to many different types of medications. I just happen to focus the most specifically on antimalarials. But so China and India are essentially global hubs for necessary drug ingredients, both for active ingredients and for excipients and for finished pharmaceuticals. So for many drugs, the map would actually look something more like this. You would have a raw ingredient or active pharmaceutical compound shipped from Madagascar to China. And then from China, if the finished compound would be shipped on to the rest of global consumers. Or it might be the raw ingredients might be sent to India, and then finished pharmaceuticals would be shipped further on from there. For both of these countries, despite being pharmacies of the world or pharmacies of the global south, this is India's project, for example, both of these countries suspended exports for various portions of the pandemic. And this suspension of exports led to pretty serious instabilities in global supply chains for necessary medicines, whether it be cancer treatments, antibiotics, COVID vaccines, any number of necessary therapeutics. Because something like 80% of the world's drug ingredients come through either China or India. So understandably, other countries became very alarmed at this dependence on only two relatively unreliable exporters in the process of the pandemic. So since 2020, something like $20 billion has been spent globally to build new manufacturing facilities for necessary drug ingredients outside of these Chinese and Indian hubs. And part of my research is precisely about this process that I call medical protectionism or medical sovereignty, where each country does its best to secure domestic medical supplies for their population. And in the wake of the pandemic, we're seeing a huge rise in the number of countries that are essentially trying to set up drug supply chains internally to be able to make drugs themselves rather than rely on imports. And one of the major reasons why countries are trying to make their own medicines is because of experiences like vaccine nationalism, where you had this intense jockeying between different countries all over the world to secure domestic vaccine supplies at the expense of worldwide access. So this infighting between, for example, the US, parts of Europe, parts of Asia has led to situations like this map, where you have vaccine, the folks in the US have been able to access 4 or 5 booster shots at this point for COVID-19 vaccines, whereas single digits of the Malagasy population has had one course of vaccination at all. So this infighting between these countries to protect their own populations sort of amplified already unequal global distributions of power and money to lead to these extremely kind of unbalanced and heterogeneous abilities to access necessary medical resources. So great work critiques the stakes of this protectionism for ending the pandemic. Proposed solutions include calling for fundamental changes to global pharmaceutical intellectual property rules. Others, for example, Otu et al.'s piece in the recently in the Lancet here, argue to do this kind of fundamental reworking of geographies of vaccine or medical production so that there can be new manufacturing hubs on the African continent. So basically, there's an argument for drug industry localization that responds to these two overarching phenomena, both the instability of global pharmaceutical supply chains, which we saw with the suspension of imports and exports from China and India, and the inequalities in global trade of finished pharmaceuticals like we see in vaccine nationalism, where African or other largely poor countries can't compete with rich countries to buy necessary drugs manufactured abroad. So the argument goes that local production of necessary medicines will solve both issues. It will solve an instability issue by having a much more constricted regional supply chain, so you don't have to ship things internationally. And it will solve the inequality or the lack of access issue if each country produces necessary ingredients or medicines for themselves. That will reduce the competition for global supplies. And this is an argument playing out across the African continent right now. For example, Morocco and Egypt are both launching major investments in pharmaceutical manufacturing capacities. This recent article discusses how Egypt is already satisfying 80% of its own local demand for pharmaceutical or for necessary medicines to be able to maximize African self-sufficiency for necessary drug materials. And my art, I study this process broadly, specifically through Madagascar, but I do this because I think it's important to pay attention to how localization happens for two major interlinked reasons. One, drug supply chains are becoming essential elements of biosecurity that rework states' envisioned obligations to their populations. Biosecurity generally pre-pandemic referred to the processes of disease surveillance and prevention that would attempt to, for example, identify emerging infectious diseases, identify outbreaks very quickly. Now, during and after the COVID-19 outbreak, it's becoming very clear that securing ample supplies of domestic medicines are also key to doing the sort of long-term pandemic response that we've been seeing for COVID-19. And this means that, for example, having stable, concrete, and well-protected pharmaceutical manufacturing supply chains is also becoming a new aspect of national security. For example, pre-pandemic, the United States was largely invested in maintaining a stockpile of domestic medicines. That stockpile, it turned out, was actually relatively inefficient. A lot of medicines we had in the US were out of date. A lot of the medical technologies available in that stockpile were not sufficient. And so now, both in the US and across the African continent, there is this increasing interest in maximizing domestic medical supply chains as part of a national security project. But as we saw with COVID-19, when global pandemic outbreaks led to these drug supply chain instabilities, stable supplies of necessary medicines also become these crucial markers of government power and capacity. So pre-pandemic, for example, drug access was generally left up to either free market activity or humanitarian intervention. This is the case in Madagascar, where there wasn't so much of a sense that the government owed it to their citizenry to have ready supplies of medical resources on hand. And this is changing with the localization for biosecurity too, where populations' ability to access medical treatments is becoming this kind of crucial marker of both government power and sort of government responsibilities to a population. And so I sort of argue throughout my work that as localization promises to maintain this medicine access for different populations, national governments also assume new vital roles in mediating public-private relationships to ensure access to therapeutic resources. And I specifically try to understand this entire process, these pandemic-induced trends in new drug industries in Madagascar. So vaccine maps like this one largely frame Madagascar as sort of empty of COVID-19 resources. You see it's literally gray on the map where it says there's 2% of vaccine access in Madagascar. This makes it seem like there isn't really that much COVID-19 therapeutics happening on the island, right? But contrary to framings like this, my research shows how Madagascar has pursued its own drug industry localization projects, not necessarily for vaccines, but for COVID-19 treatments and other necessary generic medicines that I think pretty potently illustrate how pandemic crisis intervenes in these politics of therapeutic resource production and distribution. So for the past almost 2 years, I've been following the kind of twisting and turning stories of Madagascar's pandemic response. In April 2020, the president, Andry Rajoelina, announced that Madagascar would produce its own COVID-19 treatment, COVID Organics, or CVO, and later another drug called CVO Plus in pill form that was distributed throughout the island as well as exported to other areas on the continent. The launch of CVO Plus also jump-started a national pharmaceutical manufacturing plant, Pharmalagas, that is supposed to make these COVID-19 treatments as well as other necessary generics. So if the Western world sort of leaned hard into vaccine nationalism and sort of containing vaccine resources for themselves, CVO is essentially a form of pandemic treatment nationalism, where Madagascar had an extremely sort of pro-Malagasy response, saying this is a hashtag made in Madagascar medicine. It's Malagasy resources being put to use for Malagasy people. And my research addresses how this treatment nationalism even became possible in the first place. How was the presidents of the world's poorest country able to mobilize medical ingredients so quickly to essentially jumpstart overnight an entire domestic medical industry? And what can Madagascar's experience tell us about the global rearrangement of medical industries currently underway in the wake of the pandemic? And the Madagascar case is interesting for several other reasons as well. It's a biodiversity hotspot. You all may have heard about the Malagasy lemurs, the baobabs. 80% of the flora and fauna species are endemic to the island. So there is a lot of work to enhance conservation and environmental protection in Madagascar, which means that the island is currently kind of navigating these tensions between environmental protection on one hand and industrial development and industrial change on the other hand. And in the launch of Pharmalagas and other drug industries on the island, these are kind of framed as aspects of green medicine or sustainable industry for the island to try to figure out how to make drug industries more environmentally friendly or sustainable amidst kind of global challenges with climate change. And that's an aspect that I focus on in my research. I'm happy to talk about it more in the Q&A as well. And Madagascar is also interesting because it is not one of the sort of African economic darlings like Nigeria or Rwanda, who are sort of well known for processes of economic development. It's a country that still experiences extremely high rates of poverty, economic underdevelopment. So it's an interesting case study to look at this process of localization. And above all, it's an island. Madagascar is an island, so it either has to rely on what it can produce or rely on imports and exports from elsewhere, which I think also makes it a fascinating window into what I see as a kind of continent-wide push for something like resource sovereignty, where Malagasy governments or Malagasy communities can decide how to control natural or medicinal resources for themselves and decide how necessary resources are used and distributed. So in my fieldwork, I'm primarily based in the city of Fianarantsoa in the lower right there, as well as in the capital Antananarivo, where I conducted both ethnographic research and archival research into two major pharmaceutical factories on the island, Phare Malagas and another factory in Fianarantsoa called Viver. That's a pseudonym, but it's produced anti-malarial ingredients and later other COVID-19 medicines around Fianarantsoa since the early 2000s. I've conducted over 80 interviews, over more than 2 years of research at this point, as well as extensive work in archives on Malagasy industrialization and medical politics. And one of the reasons I combine ethnographic research with archival research is because Phare Malagas's slogan is to changer l'histoire avec les sciences, so to change history with science. And one of the driving questions of my research is actually like, what history is this addressing? What history is this factory changing? How has medical self-sufficiency sort of waxed and waned on the island through time? And some major conclusions through this is that it became very clear that localizing drug supply chains is actually not at all new to the pandemic era. In fact, both of the factories that I have focused on have much longer histories of necessary drug production during various forms of global disruption, like World War II or Madagascar's socialist period in the 1980s. But for various reasons, neither factory remained consistently active after periods of global instability kind of resolved into more consistent periods of calm. They only operated in these periods of profound crisis, which I'll sort of walk you through more in a second. But I think that what is new in this pandemic era localization of drug supply chains is this sort of unprecedented link between drug access and biosecurity or national security. And I think that that has a lot to tell us about how to ensure that medical self-sufficiency projects don't just stay temporary crisis responses, but can actually become more longer-term, robust means to ensure African resource sovereignty, medical self-sufficiency, through what seems to be a sort of new era of widespread global disruption. So in the rest of this talk, I want to sort of sketch out the histories of these two factories for you very quickly to show how Madagascar's 2020s localization actually builds on these much longer, if aborted, histories of medical self-sufficiency. So let's take, for example, Phare Malagas, which is the pandemic era factory opened in October 2020 to make both CVO plus, the COVID-19 drugs that I mentioned before, and other necessary generics used throughout the island. So Phare Malagas actually occupies a site of the Oranasa Fanovana Fanafut, or UFAFA, which was established in the 1980s during Madagascar's socialist period. And UFAFA was also established to domestically manufacture necessary medicines with funding from the Malagasy government as well as Chinese partners in 1983. As a centralized state facility, UFAFA is sort of emblematic of earlier Malagasy efforts towards this sort of hashtag Made in Madagascar, medicines for Malagasy by Malagasy, and was a relatively successful and active pharmaceutical or source of medical resources on the island until its end in the 1990s. But the UFAFA itself was unfortunately short-lived. It did only operate from 1983 to the early 90s, when Madagascar's socialist period ended and state-run industries were privatized under waves of sort of externally imposed free market reforms and structural adjustment. So when institutions like the IMF and the World Bank imposed agreements for Madagascar's entry to the global economy after its transition to a free market society, the state-run UFAFA became a privately owned cashmere and knitwear facility. It started making like sweaters and other clothes with again with another Chinese partner. So at some point in its socialist period, Madagascar did have its self-sufficient drug production, but it was the rippling effects of sort of global economic policy that emptied out this manufacturing capacity and led to Malagasy dependence on imported, largely European, Chinese, or Indian drugs. So, but the news articles like this one sort of draw this through line between Far Malagas and UFAFA, and they link the island's socialist period with its COVID era kind of treatment nationalism to give a broader kind of historical justification for what in the pandemic era sort of seemed like a very profound disavowal or turn away from Euro-American kind of pharmaceutical control or pharmaceutical power, as well as a broader opposition to foreign intervention in the island. So, for example, when Madagascar commercialized its COVID drug, there was kind of extensive public celebration in a way for saying the WHO is a neo-colonial enterprise. It only wants to support Euro-American multinational corporate power. The WHO, like supporting vaccines but not Malagasy medicine, is racist. We're going to kind of go our own way and use Malagasy resources in ways that we think is effective. And that response led to a lot of debate and controversy, which I'm also happy to talk about further. But suffice it to say that the sort of resurrecting UFAFA as Far Malagas kind of condenses past and present efforts for medical self-sufficiency to fuel this kind of broader opposition to what is largely seen in Madagascar as like a foreign desire to kind of empty the island of its wealth or kind of keep Madagascar dependent on multinational industry. All right, and so the second factory is Viver in Firenze, which is the region where I base most of my research. And here too, it illustrates how this factory also recuperates longer histories of medical self-sufficiency in crisis. So Viver's facility here, the pseudonym means green life in French. It's supposed to gesture to the factory's kind of interest in sustainable or green medicine. But the factory itself has actually been operational since 1937 during Madagascar's colonization by France. And at that time, the factory was operated by the Société Rochefortaise, which was a French-owned tinned food or like canned food company that processed cattle and pigs raised in the countryside into tinned meat products. So here it used to be a food factory. It turns into this medicine factory. In the 1930s and 40s, when this factory was operational, many of the food products were exported to the colonial metropole in France, which sort of replicated this ongoing kind of critique of Malagasy wealth and Malagasy resources being sent off the island. And so this factory is sort of a distant echo of Madagascar's and the kind of general African resource curse, where raw materials are produced and processed in Madagascar, but exported for consumption and processed elsewhere. But then World War II happened, and Madagascar experienced catastrophic drug shortages as World War II disrupted global shipping and manufacturing. But many pharmaceutical compounds can be produced from cattle and pig byproducts. For example, heparin, which is a blood thinner that's produced from both cattle and pigs, as well as other necessary hormonal treatments. So, and Rochefortez, the tinned food company, had ample supplies of these animal sources for necessary drug ingredients. So the factory in Firenze started extracting these for Malagasy medical institutions, like the regional hospital in the major city. So, for example, this annual report that I found in the Malagasy National Archives extols Rochefortez for keeping the city's major hospitals supplied with other liver and tissue extracts during the course of World War II. So, what had been a sort of export oriented, kind of typically colonial um, process of sort of wealth extraction from the island actually became a source of necessary medicines during the World War II crisis. And so I think that Viver's push for these made in Madagascar medicines in the 2020s, in the pandemic, has this kind of historical precedent in Rochefortez's 1940s pivot to domestic drug making, where Malagasy people in World War II hadn't previously been able really to access, like the meat that Rochefortez was processing, but they could access the drugs that Rochefortez started making during the war. So here, the global World War II threw this wrench into de facto modes of colonial accumulation, where the war's interruptions forced these local and regional level provisioning of medical resources that was otherwise neglected in Rochefortez's earlier metropole-oriented meat exports. And Malagasy, who couldn't access the tinned meat, still benefited from the war-era therapeutic extractions where COVID, and I think COVID represents the similar inflection point of global crisis, which kind of forges new kinds of responsibility, community care, and self sufficient provisioning. But the important thing to note here is that Rochefortez ceased its medical economy after the war. The war shortage experience in World War II did galvanize multiple projects for new drug factories in Madagascar through the 1940s and the 1950s, especially for things like self sufficiency and anti malarial production. Well, the narrative went okay, we have realized after World War II global medical supply chains are unstable. Relying on European or American imports for necessary drugs is unreliable. We now need to figure out how to make our own drug factories on the island in the immediate post-war period. And I hope that you can see the parallel to this narrative now in the pandemic that says, okay, 2020, global medical supply chains are unstable. We now need to make our own factories in Madagascar. This was already happening in the 1950s, where, for example, there are pretty extensive projects to, for example, like make large quinine plantations in the north of the island and then set up quinine processing facilities throughout Madagascar to be able to make hashtag made in Madagascar anti-malarials through the 50s. For various reasons, these were thwarted. None of them actually came to pass. There is all of these plans that are sort of recorded in the National Archives to set up these drug factories, but for various reasons, French administrators nixed all of these attempts to set up factories. They said, for example, Western synthetic antimalarials are therapeutically superior. They said that a Malagasy drug factory wouldn't be cost effective, or that the land necessary to process Malagasy drugs would be better used for exportable cash crops like coffee or vanilla. So we kind of see through the archive how these colonial interests for profitable natural resource exploitation and extraction kind of viciously reasserted themselves in the immediate post-war period. Medical self-sufficiency, or sort of like scientific equity, was contained to this wartime crisis moment, and then immediately after the start of immediately after World War II, it then became sort of like the status quo, business as usual. So what then does this mean for all of the kind of transformations of drug manufacturing suggested right now in our current kind of prolonged pandemic experience. Viver and Pharmalagas have both mobilized Malagasy natural resources and manufacturing capacity to make these domestic treatments and to make new necessary generics as well. But the anthropologist Joe Masco reminds us that crisis response is often a conservative modality that stabilizes an existing structure within a radically contingent world. I've just gone through how this applies to the Rochefort-Tez case in World War II, and in many ways, I think that you could say that Pharmalagas also stabilizes existing structures. To pick up on Javier's point about corruption, the president of Madagascar took a financial stake in Pharmalagas. The grand narrative of national medical self-sufficiency also enriched himself and other Malagasy elites. And while COVID-19 drugs were sort of widely distributed through the island in 2020, the follow-on pill-based products have largely only remained in urban pharmacies or hospitals that are largely inaccessible to the vast majority of rural Malagasy, who tend to actually shun going to clinics or hospitals because it's generally thought like these are the places where you go to die. This is not where you go to get successful treatment. And actually, many of the Malagasy communities that I work with in rural areas around Fianarantsoa actively shun Pharmalagas's finished pills as eating politics. They instead use teas, decoctions, steam baths prepared with Malagasy medicinal herbs and other plants that grow in this area. And they say that proper medicine should be drank or inhaled, but it shouldn't be eaten as a pill in a sort of broader rejection of these state pharmaceuticals. So David Graeber called Malagasy the original anarchists for their extremely contentious relationship to forms of state authority. And here, Pharmalagas and Viver aren't like a post-colonial self-sufficiency or a pandemic-era biosecurity to be cheered or supported, but as one farmer put it, a colonialism by the state to be actively decried and resisted. For the Malagasy urban elite appropriation of rural resources and labor. So let's go back to the original justification for pandemic just localization of pharmaceutical supply chains. You say that localization will solve supply chain instability and global medical inequality. Pharmalagas and Viver both purport to protect the Malagasy population from both of these. And actually, the island didn't order very many vaccines at all because they argued Madagascar already has our own COVID treatment, so vaccination isn't necessary. But in rural Malagasy communities' preference for homegrown medicinal herbs over state drugs, it ultimately sort of defies these state promises of made in Madagascar medicines in the first place. My friends in the countryside sort of shun any factory, whether it's Malagasy or European or Indian, and they prefer to bring home their treatment straight from the field. And so this is sort of medical self-sufficiency or biosecurity in another form as a community practice and as a community resource over a state or a national project. And one that the sort of tension between community interests and national projects and national interests all sort of have to like take into account in the broader assessment of pandemic impacts to both global industry and state population relationships. So thank you very much, and happy to answer any questions.
Gabrielle, thank you very much. Thank you. It was enlightening, your presentation. I was wondering from how you start to display a new world order, how China and India are really the main producers of vaccines, and then you led us to the processes of manufacturing, how they relocate the plants from the original the metropolis to another economies. And then I can't help to wonder about this concept that due to the sign of the USMCA, we really talk a lot about nearshoring, And I was wondering, due to the location of Madagascar, is that suitable for Madagascar economy as well? So I do have a lot of questions for both of you. First of all, I have a common question, and we will also pick some questions from the public. So if you have any question, this is the time. But I would like to start by this. Africa is well known because they know how to deal, or they should have learned how to deal with epidemics. You were talking about malaria, for instance. So what can we learn from the epidemics in Africa, or what did we actually learn from the epidemics in Africa to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic? So that will be my first question. I was thinking that maybe there are some interesting interactions with colonialism and neocolonialism. So maybe we can start the same order as you presented. Please, Javier.
Yes. Yeah, I think that there is a lot of lessons. No? We have epidemics of Ebola, AIDS, and I think that in themes of corruption, there start to be initiatives of social sectors that are asking for transparency, are asking for access to health, are asking for access to public services that they don't have and that they didn't have, no? And they are also asking for access to better conditions of life. No, the movement of NSARS in Nigeria, it's an example. No? A lot of people say that this movement of hashtag NSARS, it's like a negation of the pandemic. No, and this wasn't the negation of the pandemic. They were asking for better conditions for work, for better conditions for journalists, for example. And this is because a lot of people in Nigeria, as in other sectors of Sub-Saharan Africa, lives with $1 a day, with access of $1, $2 a day. And when the governments start to close everything, they didn't have access to that income. And this is why they start to get out to the streets. And the government responds with public force. No? In Lekitol, they kill like 16, 20 people. There is a documentary of the BBC that shows that it was the responsibility of the Nigerian military, the killing of the massacre of Lekitol. So I think that this kind of lessons, this kind of issues, didn't come for the governments, or didn't were learned by the governments. They were learned by the civil society, and they have initiatives that start by public sectors and not politic sectors, that as they are asking for transparency, they are demanding better conditions in this kind of crisis.
Thank you, Javier. Gabrielle, please go ahead.
Sure, thank you so much. I think that's a very rich and layered question that we could probably just talk about for the rest of today. But suffice it to say, on sort of how does African epidemic experience, like what can be learned about that for COVID response? I think the main thing that I would want to keep in mind is how much the idea of an epidemiological transition actually doesn't apply in the African context. So for the epidemiological transition in medical anthropology, it's sort of the idea that as regions or countries move through stages of economic change, infectious disease decreases while things like chronic disease increase. But for my research on that in Madagascar, is actually very clear that infectious and chronic disease are always kind of going hand in hand in ways that local communities have figured out how to treat and manage, often very creatively and with a good deal of innovation, even without very much state preparation or state intervention. So, for example, like I came to Madagascar on the heels of the Omicron wave in December 2021, where I was very curious to sort of see how the Malagasy farmers I was working with in the countryside were responding to COVID-19. And all of them said, hey, we're not actually that worried about COVID infection at all. We live in our villages are small. There's not so much transit to and from the city. We actually have much worse things to worry about, things like chronic malnutrition, consistent, like untreated diabetes, ongoing sort of increases in rates of asthma, as well as the sort of like ongoing issue, like injuries from working with livestock and pursuing an agrarian lifestyle, where COVID infection was very low on the list of priorities for them to deal with. COVID inflation was actually a huge worry. Madagascar's inflation increased to something like 15%. But it was more the economic impacts of the pandemic than the bodily, infectious, or medical impacts that people were very worried about. There is also a sort of ongoing narrative of we work hard every day, we're farmers, we're not obese, we don't have very many of the risk factors for serious COVID-19 that had led to, for example, very high mortality in the United States. So I think that in kind of approaches to pandemic response on the continent, it's important to keep those local or community level interpretations of what is health, how does health work, where does health come from, how do we deal with the kind of many overlapping threats to health in one given context, without, for example, assuming that just because COVID-19 is the new sort of global infectious disease, that it's the major concern for Malagasy people. For example, there's a major effort right now in the Social Science Research Council to figure out how to increase vaccination rates in the global south. But for most of the folks I work with, they say, like like our immune systems are already so strong by the levels of things that we have to contend with in our day-to-day life, whether it be soil bacteria or, like cattle tick-borne disease, malaria, any number of pretty serious bodily infections that COVID-19 didn't really rank. That's something that I was honestly quite surprised by, but sort of makes sense once you start talking to people about what are the actual things that they worry about every day. So in terms of what can be learned from that, I think for me it was a major lesson in sort of maintaining the anthropological value of relativism, that even if COVID-19 is a sort of major overarching public health concern in the United States, that may change if you change your given context. And to have pandemic response that is as sensitive to or respectful to kind of what in medical anthropology would be called like local biologies, rather than an overarching sort of this has to be the major concern because that's what the WHO says. That was an argument that many Malagasy, especially rural farmers I know, took a lot of issue with. Where they were much more concerned about chronic malnutrition than COVID-19, for example.
Of course, the field experience should be totally different, like from the interest of worldwide. I don't want to monopolize the floor. So is there any question, comment from the public? Jose Luis, please. I don't think we have a microphone, so I think we do.
Good morning. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have my question is more small than Vanya's. I have two questions for Gabrielle, very specific one. The first one, I know that it is not the focus on your research, but I was very interested in one of your slides where we can see the importance of Morocco in the global distribution of medical supplies. I don't know if you can give more reasons why Morocco holds this such a central place in this distribution scheme. And the other question has more to do with your research. we have seen in recent years that Madagascar is struggling in a lot of senses, economic, social, political sense. And I don't know how is, you talked a little bit during your presentation, but how is this discourse coming from the head of the state, this policy of localizing the pharmaceutical industry in Madagascar, how is it reappropriated, or how is it understood by the population, especially by the population you are working with in the field work? Because also it also drew my attention a photograph that you showed in one of your slides, where there is these women working the soil, and her skirt, in her skirt there's a photograph of the president. So you were talking us that that this policy was received by society with a lot of skepticism, but at the same time there are these dynamics, these political dynamics, very common in Africa, of clientelistic parties, clientelistic democracy, the clientelistic political system. So how can they make a sense of these like paradoxical political stances? I don't know if you can further a little bit your explanation in that sense. Thank you.
Two wonderful questions. So first on Morocco, you're correct that it is quite a central hub for pharmaceutical distribution, especially throughout the African continent. For example, a lot of pharmaceuticals, both made in Europe and made in China and India, are either finished and packaged in Morocco and then transported on from there. And that's for several reasons. So first of all, in the 1980s and 1990s, Morocco was very invested in a process of industrialization and economic development that focused on sort of like manufacturing and other sort of major industries. For example, there's a gas refinery right next to this drug factory that then exports things from Morocco, so I sort of see Morocco as like India, in that India sort of frames itself as a pharmacy for the global south. And I think Morocco and Egypt more and more now are sort of framing themselves as pharmacies for the African continent. There's been a pretty and Morocco has access to sources of funds from China and from Europe that may not be as easy to access, for example, from Madagascar. And there's several sort of subsidiaries and subsidiaries of European multinationals that also operate in the sort of industrial zone between Casablanca and Tangier. So that all of that combined has led to this sort of efflorescence or growth of Morocco's centrality to medical networks on the island. And I have a side project actually on this, which is why I'm happy you picked up on it and happy to talk about it more too afterward. And it's like, as I mentioned in this slide, Egypt is attempting to do this sort of localization process too. Morocco has a similar goal to be totally self-sufficient in its own medical supplies, which is on its way to meeting. And part of that goal is also to then become a major source of necessary medicines on the continent. So it's both a sort of nationalistic, like this is going to improve the stance of Morocco and a source of national pride, as well as a articulation of this kind of South-South kind of Pan-African solidarity or Pan-African kind of union in providing, like the continent providing for itself, essentially. And I'm honestly I'm very interested in how that dynamic plays out, especially given ongoing kind of racial and religious tensions between, for example, like the primarily Arabic speaking, like Arab identifying Moroccan population, and it's kind of cold shoulder to sub-Saharan migrants, for example, like coming through the country as well. So in terms of like economic links, you have this kind of articulation of a Pan-Africanism that doesn't often play out in its actual relationships with neighboring countries or with other countries south of the Sahara. In terms of Madagascar's sort of localization and of necessary medical supply chains and then regional responses to it, some important context to keep in mind for this that I wasn't able to fit in the talk is that Madagascar has pretty contentious ethnic and social divisions between the largely elite groups that are in the highlands of the island, who largely, for example, like occupy positions of government, industrial leadership, economic leadership, and more rural countryside and coastal populations, who are also framed as sort of blacker, more African. Because Madagascar was settled by people moving east from the African continent, as well as people moving west from the Indonesian, Malaysian, Polynesian islands, there's a massive phenotypic heterogeneity of people who sort of like look Asian and then people who look African. And for example, like in the photo of the president, you can kind of see like he wouldn't be thought of as like as a black man in Madagascar. But the part of the reason why the folks that I work with in the countryside see this pharmaceutical industry as a process of colonialism by the state is because they're in a region that was first violently conquered by the Highland Marina people before colonization, and then sort of subjugated on racial and class lines during the colonial administration and during the socialist period. So you have this sort of these layers of histories of animosity that all kind of revolve around, are you a Marina person? Are you a Bethaleo person? Are you an urban person? Are you a countryside person? Are you a highland person? Are you a coastal person? That sort of lead to these senses that state authority is sort of inherently suspect, and that state projects are inherently authoritarian or extractive or abusive in some ways. So, for example, I'm sorry I can't get my slides back. I don't know how to do that. But for example, for the folks in that photo with the lady with the wrap with the president's face, those are distributed throughout the countryside in election years to try to drum up support. And are sort of like the president's face is always ubiquitous everywhere in Madagascar, in ways that I think kind of cover over some of the more contentious interpretations of like what state power is and how we should relate to it. And for sure, the state itself, the president, the Economic Development Council of Madagascar sort of frame the increase of these drug industries as an economic development tool, as a way to sort of improve Madagascar's economic position on the global sphere in the region. But it's a framing that is sort of very much disagreed with by the folks that actually power these. And for example, all of these ladies are like growing the medicinal plants that would then be extracted to be used in the state COVID drugs. And they say, sure, we grow these and we sell them to the government, but we would never actually take like the medicine that they're making. And like the government having distributed this medicine throughout the countryside, people were like, this isn't the medicine this isn't even the way you're supposed to have a medicine. You're supposed to drink it, you're supposed to inhale it, you're not supposed to eat it in a little pill. And the state medicines too are like the same orange as like that orange in the on her skirt, which is the presidential party's color, in a way that like so clearly ties like political party power to pandemic response, that I do also see this as like a form of pandemic politicization sort of outside the US or outside of Europe. But that leads to a lot of kind of assessments that this is like, it's eating politics, in a way that people are very opposed to.
Gabrielle, thank you very much for bringing all your research to us. And also, Javier, thank you very much for your presentation. This is a great way to start our colloquium. We need to finish our panel number 1. We will make a quick change of presidium, and we'll be back in some minutes. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Good morning again, everyone. Please take your seats. We're going to start with the opening ceremony in a few minutes. I would like to start by saying thank you to all the entities and institutions that made possible today's colloquium. And I would like to introduce today's authorities. First of all, Dr. Gabriela Rios, on behalf of the Vice Presidency of Humanities of UNAM. Ambassador Octavio Tripp, Regional Bureau of Africa, Central Asia, and the Middle East, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Government of Mexico. Dr. Francisco Trigo, International Head Office of UNAM. Dr. Armando Sanchez, Director of the Institute of Economic Research. And Dr. Alicia Giron, Director of the University Program of Studies on Asia and Africa. Welcome you all. We will start with the opening ceremony. And please, Dr. Giron, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Maria de la Bagashota, our academic secretary. Well, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, or good night, whatever you are in this global world. First of all, we are very happy to be here in the third Colloquium of Studies on Africa, framing Africa as epicenter of the world. I'm going to have some highlights, and because I think it is very important why our university is studying Africa. And these highlights that I took this weekend, they are based in the UNCTAD report, but also in the Sub-Saharan report of the International Monetary Fund that was presented last week. So first, we must, I agree that the 21st century is the century of Africa. It is the economic region that has the natural resources of the future. Number one, under the soil of Africa hide, for example, more than 40% of gold stocks, 55% of diamonds, 66% of cobalt, and more than 80% of platinum. Africa has over half of the world's cobalt and copper. It exports over 75% of the world's chromium, ore, and manganese. And these are all minerals and metals that are in high demand, particularly for some of these clean energy supply chains. These metals that are in high demand, particularly for some of these clean energy supply chains, these enormous wealth consists with problems that end up affecting in one way or another. The extractive industry, from armed conflicts, such as the one in the northeast of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, to rampant corruption. The second one, rare earths are critical for human and national security. So we see them in electronics. They are in your phones, they are in your computers, they are important for renewable energy technology, our wind turbines, our solar panels. But they are also critical for national defense. So we are talking about jet engines, missile guidance, and anti-missile defense systems, GPS equipment. And in 2021, the demand of these reaches 125,000 metric tons. 9 years later, we are expecting to see that rise to 315,000 tons. And these are all minerals and metals that are in high demand, particularly for some of these clean energy supply chains. The third one, Africa has a demographic bonus that many countries do not have, such as Japan and some European countries, even China, where it is decreasing population, and India has just passed during these days to this great power. UNCTAD report mentions globally 733 million people, or about 9.1% of the world's populations, lack access to electricity. In sub-Saharan Africa alone, 600 million people, or approximately 53% of the region's population, live without access to electricity. Hundreds of millions more have only limited or unreliable electricity. The fifth one, commodities account for more than 60% of total mercantile exports in 45 of the 54 countries in Africa, leaving them highly vulnerable to global commodity price shocks and undermining the continent's inclusive growth and development prospects. 83% of African countries are highly dependent on commodities. Africa is considered still by many Western and US business to be very risky. A lot of these commodities are in places where there's poor infrastructure, often unrest. Where a lot of these rare earth minerals come from in Eastern Congo, that's been war for decades. There's militia. So there are a lot of concerns that American business have about going into Africa. Even the US government is now trying to help facilitate for them to enter the continent in ways that they haven't previously. So the US is basically looking to get American companies more involved in a space that's been dominated by Chinese companies for well over a decade. I have three more pages. I'm not going to read it because this was the highlights that I took in this weekend. But I think it is very important to say that Janet Yellen, the secretary of the she was the secretary of the Federal Reserve Bank, and now she's she is the president of the Treasury of USA. She was just a few weeks ago in a tour of 10 days trying to invite the American companies to invest in Africa. And also, Kamala Harris was in Ghana. She was also in a short tour because USA is afraid, very afraid, of Chinese investment in Africa. So this is very, I think that's that's the reality. China, of course, not only in Africa. China is in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in Central Asia. But this is one of the keys to understand why China and USA are in a bad agreement right now. The other thing that in the report is said is that it is very important to see that at least the projections is going to descend for the next year for Africa countries. And there are countries that it is very, very interesting to see the economic forecast. For example, Niger will increase the GDP from 6.1 this year to 10.6, and Niger from 6.1 to 13.0%. But even that, the thing is that the problem of Africa, as the problem in Latin America, in Mexico, and in all the countries, even in the developed countries, is inflation and the interest rate. So are some issues that we are going to talk during our next sessions, and we are very happy that you are here. Thank you very much, Francisco Trigo, for the resources that you gave us to have this meeting here. We have people from UMass, from Boston University, for other universities, and also to our coordinator, to Gabriela, thank you very much, and also to our coordinator, Guadalupe Valencia, that give also the funding to have our key speaker, and also our ambassador, Octavio Tripp. Thank you very much for being here in this conference. We hope to work very close with your office in the Cancilleria. And of course, thank you to my chief, my chief, Armando Sanchez, who always accept that we have, the PUEA has most of the events here when they are in presence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Giron. Dr. Armando Sanchez, Director of the Institute of Economic Research at UNAM. Please, your welcome remarks.
Thank you, Juan. Good morning, everyone. I appreciate the presence of Mr. Ambassador Octavio Tripp, Professor Gabriela Rios, thank you, Dr. Francisco Trigo, and of course, I want to say thank you to Alicia Giron, our emeritus professor here at the Institute for Economic Research. For our institute is a great honor and a great satisfaction to participate in this colloquium, which of course is coordinated by the UEA and by our emeritus professor, Alicia Giron. This colloquium has a long history. It has promoted and fostered international relations among Mexico and other countries, among our university and other universities at an international level. So that's what we are proud of, having this kind of event here. In this occasion, the colloquium will be a perfect space for reflection on the current dynamics of African countries. We are going to talk about its growth, its education, the geopolitics, and other topics that are really interesting for all of us in here at the university. I am sure that we will learn important lessons from this colloquium, so I invite you all to participate and get a strong engagement in all the activities. I am very sure that that will be very rich for every one of us. Finally, I thank you again for the invitation to this event, and I extend the most warm welcome to our institute and to this colloquium. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Francisco Trigo, International Head Office of UNAM. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you, either in presence or on the distance. Thank you very much, Dr. Armando Sanchez, for hosting this important meeting. You know that we appreciate your solidarity with the organization of all these events. Ambassador Octavio Tripp, thanks a lot for being here present and representing the Ministry of Foreign Relations of Mexico. Alicia Giron, thanks again for highlighting the relevance of the relationship with Africa, and particularly developing a well-developed program with issues of current interest internationally. I think was very well developed, and the number of guests that you have joined for this activity is certainly of high quality. Gabriela Rios, thank you very much for representing our Vice Presidency for Humanities at UNAM. It's always a pleasure to be here with you. The linkage of UNAM with Africa has been increasing in the last years, and we are very pleased with that, with this South to South collaboration. Let me tell you that one important highlight was the creation of the Nelson Mandela Chair about 8 years ago, due to the initiative of the ambassador of South Africa at that time, Mr. Sandile Noshina, who was very motivational in creation of that chair that is focused mostly on human rights. Annual events are organized under that chair and has certainly highlighted the relevance of the study of human rights in Mexico and in Africa in general terms. We have had the pleasure of having really remarkable speakers from South Africa and other countries during the years, and that's certainly a landmark here in our university. The collaboration with Africa mostly relates to South Africa, and we have 6 current agreements. The interaction of academicians is certainly important, and we have at this time with South Africa more than 800 joint publications in the last 10 years, which shows the connectivity present between our academicians from South Africa and from UNAM. And certainly we encourage that collaboration. With Morocco is another key partner in Africa, with 6 agreements also with different Moroccan universities, related from Mohammed V University to Agadir to Tetuan, Marrakech, and so on. And so there's a rich interaction, particularly in research with Morocco on issues like climate change, biodiversity, and One Health. So we look very encouraged for these activities that your program has developed, Alicia, particularly for highlighting the relevance of Africa already with this third international colloquium of studies on Africa. And I'm sure that the public, either present here or on distance, will be very satisfied with the high quality of the program you and your team have developed. So I wish you a very successful meeting, and that will be very pleasant for everybody. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Trigo. Ambassador Octavio Tripp, Regional Bureau for Africa, Central Asia, and the Middle East, from the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Government of Mexico. Welcome to UNAM.
Thank you, Vanya. Thank you very much. First of all, congratulations to the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM. For me, it's always a pleasure as a postgraduate of this university and excuse to visit UNAM. It's not only an honor, but a pleasure to be here. So thank you for the invitation. And talking in an institutional way, let me start my remarks with 2 things. The first one is congratulating the UNAM for organizing this colloquium, to the Humanities Coordination, the Institute of Economic Research, and of course, the University Program of Studies on Asia and Africa, the famous PUEA. Now it's a famous program all over the world. And the second message is that Vanya told me in a very strict way that I have only 3 minutes for my intervention, my participation. So in order to be sure that I will be observing this instruction, you will have to be very tolerant listening my formal remarks it lasts 3 minutes exactly. So with your permission, I will share with you some reflections about Africa and its interaction with Mexico. And let me start saying that all efforts made in Mexico to promote the analysis and the discussions about Africa deserve to be supported, considering that we still have a lot to learn about this continent to materialize 2 things: all the cooperation opportunities that Mexico and Africa have ahead, and to what? In order to reach a more dynamic and fruitful interaction. Currently, as you know, and Alicia elaborated a little bit about it, Africa is again the space of a sharp geopolitical competition. As it happened in the previous centuries, in the 19th century among the European powers, and later on in the 20th century between the United States and Russia under the context of the Cold War. And the reasons to explain the rediscovered interest in Africa, not only by the traditional powers, but now with emerging powers in the international arena, are multiple. As Dr. Giron mentioned a few minutes ago, the African wealth in strategical mineral resources and its impressive biodiversity, but also its growing relevance in the world's energy market and the dynamic economic growth of this continent. Not to mention the fact that by 2050, a quarter of the planet's population will be in Africa, and mainly young people. This is why Africa is becoming the epicenter of the world, as you appropriately quoted in the title of this colloquium. And it's not a coincidence either, the cascade, if you allow me the expression, of African summits hosted from Washington and Beijing, passing through Brussels and Moscow, among many other cities and other relevant international powers in the world. However, and this is very important, unlike previous centuries, the African nations are more aware of the need to manage the current geopolitical competition in their favor. The African governments seems to be better equipped to exploit the balance of power according to their own interest to avoid the abuses of the past. In such geopolitical context, the African nations must have not only the solidarity but the cooperation of countries like Mexico, without any interest of dominance and just a genuine aspiration in favor of a South-South collaboration cause, as Dr. Trigo mentioned a few minutes ago. Mexico, Latin America, and Africa have compatible interests in many relevant fields, such as the main topics of the global agenda and the Millennium Development Goals, among many others. And all of us, I mean Mexico, Latin America, and Africa, also share the political right to progress without any tutelage of the great powers. Nevertheless, to crystallize the compatibility of interest in a pragmatic way, it's imperative to build the skills and specialize human resources in several areas of the public and private sector, and do the same in the academy and the entire society. So, as you can imagine, dear friends, the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs, la Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores, really celebrate initiatives like this one we are opening today. Honest discussions and educated reflections about Africa are not only going to update us about the situation in Africa, but these kind of discussions are going to contribute in a very relevant way to the intellectual sophistication of the students, researchers, and all those interested in Africa and also in the African-Mexico interaction. So let me conclude my remarks, dear members of the Presidium, dear friends of the Auditorium, about the relevance of this kind of events. A few minutes ago, I was commenting with Alicia Giron that normally we are focused in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs attending emergencies and the day-by-day issues. But it's very difficult to study in the long term the interactions with the relationship with Africa. And this kind of events helps a lot in order to do that, in order to improve the intellectual skills of the Mexican specialists in Africa. Let me conclude my remarks applauding this effort, this initiative of the UNAM, and again, thank you on the invitation in order to take part in this colloquium. I wish you a fruitful discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Finally, Dr. Gabriela Rios, on behalf of Dr. Guadalupe Valencia, Vice Presidency for Humanities, UNAM. Please, Doctor, give us your opening statement.
Yes. Thank you, Vanna. Good morning. On behalf of the Humanity Coordinator, Guadalupe Valencia, I am very pleased to participate in this opening ceremony of the third International Colloquium of Studies on Africa, framing Africa as a world epicenter organized by National Autonomous University of Mexico through the University Program of Studies of Asia and Africa and UNAM headquarters in Boston, Massachusetts. And thank you, Alicia Giron, for all the effort and courage to give you for this colloquium. Thank you very much. And I'm pleased to greet and welcome Octavio Tripp, Head of the Regional Office for Africa, Central Asia, and the Middle East of the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Many thanks for the Institute of Economic Research and his director, Armando Sanchez, for hosting this activity. Likewise, I'm pleased to greet Dr. Francisco Trigo, Director of International Head Office for Permanent Support of the Task of Internationalization in our university. Thank you for the coordination of humanities at UNAM. It's important to review the social, economic, and geopolitical processes that have their epicenter in converge on Africa's continent, where until 2022, nearly 18% of the world's population is concentrated, which is slightly more than double population in Latin America and Caribbean, close to 18.5% of the world's population. The four themes that have been identified in this working agenda for colloquium are Africa as Epicenter is transforming world, health security and post-pandemic effects of pandemics, health security post-pandemic effects on society, global and regional conflicts, effects on Russia and Ukraine's conflict, soft cooperation and climate change, economic issues in Africa, inflation, poverty, and climate change. Each of these topics represents the possibility of opening, expanding, and giving the continuity on academic dialogue that favor learning about the elements as well as the share in our society and our country. In this way, by identifying the challenges, application of social public policy, as well as the mechanism of organization and social action, it will be possible to obtain more precise approximations of regional capacities, moving away from generalizations to tend to emphasize deficit indicators whose evaluation sometimes designed from perspectives that alien the environments and social formation present in our regions. Likewise, based on this reflection, it will be possible to promote a space and mechanisms for cooperation between educational and research institutions in both continents to make effective the favor of perceptive as state in one of topics that are part of the Colloquium agenda. Another of the points is common in our countries of lately have is common the relevance of the humanity, social science, and science in development on society as is possible to achieving global integration under the best possible conditions. I only wish you the best success in the session to be held today and tomorrow. And thank you for attention. I think I have to inaugurate. Okay. And then for these words, being 11 with 13 minutes, I declare the official open this colloquium, and I wish you the best of successful of the words, and thank you for being here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rios. Thank you to all our authorities. And thank you, dear students which are today at the auditorium. And also thank you to all the audience who is following us on streaming, especially for those in Boston. And please remain seated. We are moving forward to the panel number 2, Global and Regional Conflicts, Effects of Russia and Ukraine's Conflict. You can check out the program of the colloquium at puea.unam.mx. Thank you very much, and thank you all.
¿Con ellos? Bueno, okay. Good morning and welcome. And thank you for joining us at the second panel, Global and Regional Conflict, Effects of Russia and Ukraine's Conflict. Today we are joined by three speakers, Adriana Franco, who is here presential, Donia Dowidar, who is by streaming, and Ames Taher. So first of all, I am going to introduce them briefly, and I am going to start with Adriana Franco. Adriana Franco holds a master's degree in Asian and African Studies from El Colegio de México, and a bachelor's degree in International Relations from the National Autonomous University of Mexico. She is a professor at the Faculty of Political and Social Science at the SEB University and in the International Relations program at the Universidad Autónoma de Querétaro. She is a member of the Latin American Observatory of Geopolitics of the Institute of Economic Research at the UNAM, and a collaborator of the University Program of Studies on Asia and Africa. She has been a speaker at various events, including the Second International Colloquium on African Studies and the Fifth Conference of Strategic Studies. Her most recent articles are Women in Africa, Genealogies of Violence and Violence Against Women, analysis of three recent African novels. Welcome, Adriana. Our second speaker is Donia Dowidar. With over a decade of research in agricultural and rural economics, a focus on political economy of development has been established. Teaching experience spans 10 years, including both online and remote learning environments, and a diverse range of learners. The double qualification in economics and law offers a comprehensive understanding of the subject. Qualitative analysis and synthesis of economic data is a demonstrated skill, as is experience in administrative and pedagogical evaluation and support. 4 years of presidency in the French coordination of the FIAN NGO, Food First Information and Action Network, highlights leadership experience. Fluency in Arabic, French, and English presents strong communication abilities. And welcome to Donia, who is by streaming. And finally, I am going to introduce Ames Taher. He studied Bachelor of Economics and Political Science in the Faculty of Economics and Political Science, Cairo University. He did a major specialization in political science and a minor specialization in economics. He also did a Bachelor of Law in the Faculty of Law in Cairo University. His master thesis in political science specialization is about international law and international organization. He did a PhD dissertation in political science, Faculty of Economic and Political Science, Cairo University. He is currently the director of Al-Hewar Center for Political and Media Studies, lecturer in political science and law, lecturer in the field of qualifying for political and diplomatic world. So thank you, and we are listening first to Donia Dowidar. She is by streaming, so please help us with. Si nos pueden ayudar a presentar en la pantalla, por favor. Thank you. Welcome, Donia.
Can you hear me, please? Because I can't hear you now, but okay. So if you can hear me, can you nod, please, with your head? Okay, perfect. So I will start to my presentation. So I would like to start by thanking you a lot for inviting me to this third international colloquium of studies in Africa. I have to thank especially the committee of the organization for the quality of the organization, and I want to specifically thank Professor Alicia Giron for inviting me and for the enormous work that has been done to organize this colloquium. So today I will share with you an in-progress paper that I'm working on. It's entitled, the title of the paper is the Russia-Ukraine War and how it affects the deepening of the chronic dependency in Egypt. So first of all, I want to share with you the plan of the presentation today. I will introduce very quickly, and then I will present the food regimes in Egypt and the impacts of the new liberal and corporate food regimes. And then I will present my alternative agri-system in terms of food sovereignty proposal. Then we will go to results and perspective. I want to share with you, this is the map of Egypt for the people who doesn't know this country. So just the green area here on the riverside, on the Nile riverside, both ones are representing the arable land in Egypt. So it's very small in proportion of the surface of Egypt, the superficies. So very quickly, you can see that there is a small increase of the arable land as a percentage of the land area in Egypt. It was like, on 2000, it was like 2.8% of the total land area. And it's on 2020, it's almost 3.4% of the total land area of Egypt. But we have to not to be fooled by this increase of total arable land, because if we see the arable land hectares per person, so it was stagnation. From here you can see on this one, so it's there is even a small decrease. So it went from here in the 70s 0.7 hectares per person to now 0.03 now. So it's very it's decreasing actually. In the introduction, I want to present you to the national context of the last decade in Egypt. So in 2008, we had the food riots in Egypt, and there was dead people for the queues of bread, for buying bread. And then we have the 2011 revolution. The main slogan was bread, freedom, and social justice. And then we can see that there is a crisis of the Egyptian agri-foods. There is some structural causes, but mainly there is conjunctural causes that evokes this crisis every time, like COVID, like Ukraine war, and I will explain later why. And we can observe so that we can see that there is a major food dependency of the agri-food system in Egypt, because Egypt eats mainly the basic food commodity in Egypt is bread, and bread is made from wheat, and we are the first importer of wheat in the world. So you can see on the right here that we are on the first country on the top 10 of the importance of wheat. And we can see also that we have a chronic deficit of the Egyptian trade balance on the left side, my left side. And then I want to also talk about poverty in Egypt, that it's mainly a rural phenomenon. Poverty rate, it's almost 32.5% of the population. It's more, of which more than 60% live in the rural areas. And today, I told you the global image of what's happening in the agri-food system. I want to focus more on the magnitude of the impact of the war in Ukraine on the agri-food system in Egypt. So first of all, in March 2022, there was a publication of the MEI Policy Center that said that overnight, there was a huge increasing of the prices of wheat, 44%, and for wheat, and for the prices of sunflower oil, it's 32%. To explain this, so we are dependent of Ukraine and Russia for like 85% of the wheat coming from outside Egypt. And when it concerns the sunflower oil, we are 73% dependent on the Russian-Ukrainian markets for our supplies. So that's why the magnitude of this impact of this war was huge on the agri-food system in Egypt. And then I want you to show you some things to explain. Egypt has a specificity that the private consumption has an enormous percentage of the nominal GDP in Egypt. So it's above the average rate of the North African countries. It's the average rate, it's between like 59, 60. Egypt private consumption percentage of nominal GDP, it's always like for the last decades, it's between 80 and more, sometimes little bit less, but you will see on the quarter that the war began in Ukraine, that the consumption decreased from 82% of the GDP to 77% because of the inflation and the increasing of prices of wheat and other basic commodity in Egypt that are mostly imported from Ukraine and Russia. So I will come back on the main introduction. It was to introduce you to what's happening exactly and why it's very important to see the impact of this war on the agri-food system in Egypt. So the main objectives of my paper, it was to identify the causes of the agri-food system recurrent crisis and what are the main challenges that are facing the agri-food system in Egypt and its actors too, and to identify the evolution of the agrarian question in Egypt throughout the three food regimes that I will present later, but very fast, and we can discuss this later in the question. And I want to introduce you my theoretical framework. I chose to work on the food regime theory because this approach provided me specially of a macro historical framework and holistic analysis of the agri-food system on the world or international level that permitted me to understand what is happening on the national market of Egypt. And why especially food regime theory? Because this theory represents us an analytical framework that allows us to articulate what happens in the international relation of production, consumption, marketing of agri-food products in the world, and really it articulates this to the form of the capitalistic accumulation that distinguished the different periods of the capitalistic transformation since 1870. So it was firstly presented by Friedman and McMichael. So I adopted this theory to explain what happened to Egypt, how the food or the chronic food dependency was created, how the agri-food system in Egypt was restructured through the British hegemony, the American hegemony, the corporate hegemony later. And my conceptual framework, it's mainly food sovereignty, because for me, it's a political tool and also an operational framework towards the alternative of the agri-food regime that I'm presenting, and it's a rights-based approach. So I will go very fast on the food regimes, but I will present the main characteristics so you can understand historically how the chronic dependency of Egypt was created through those different food regimes. The first one is the colonial food regimes. So here it was the British hegemony. So to be as brief as possible, back then in 1861, the American Civil War was happening. So Great Britain lost her wheat basket, and they went to Egypt so they can replace this wheat basket from America and to Egypt. So they started to restructure the agri-food system to serve the interest of Great Britain to export wheat and later cotton. And a lot of restructuring of the agri-food system was mainly to serve the British colonization happened in this era. And then we can see the neoliberal food regime. It started from 1950, and we will see from 1950 to 1970 an American hegemony that was in place, and they started to introduce their system, the very well-known program Food for Peace. So it was a food aid, and they started to go to the countries and said, okay, you don't have to have substance agriculture. We can give you weight as an aid, and you can focus on another crops like the cash crops and the more exportable crops in agriculture. So we will see that the history there, but to be brief, the wheat imports in Egypt rose from 0.1 in 1951 to now, actually, it's representing, we are importing like 50% of our basic need in wheat. And then we have finally to explain what is the corporate food regime. It starts around 1980. So it starts with what we call the Infitah policies, the new liberal policy that was adopted by President Sadat back then. And it conciliated with the program of structural adjustment of the FMI in the World Bank. And then we started to see that there is different actors, corporate actors, that are integrating the food regime in Egypt or the agro-food system in Egypt, because we will see that the transnational firm had a lot of difficulties to integrate the Egyptian market. So it was due to the bureaucracy, that corruption, administration, and the heavy procedures to integrate the market. So they choose an intermediate capital, it's the Gulf capital, to integrate the Egyptian market. So I can give you a partnership between the Gulf and the Western brands very, very briefly to show you. Americana, it's a Kuwaiti Gulf company, and it had the franchise of KFC, Heinz, Hardee's, Pizza Hut, Baskin Robbins, and in Egypt. And El Marai, it's a Saudi company, so it has the franchise of PepsiCo in Egypt and Jordan. El Shaya, the Kuwaiti one, it has the franchise of Starbucks in Egypt and other Middle Eastern and Northern African countries. Olayan, it's a Saudi one, and it has the franchise of Coca-Cola, and so on. The impacts of the neoliberal and corporate food regime, mainly that they have a role. This foreign capital had an impact and a huge role in reshaping our food system. Okay, we had systemic and systematic risks that occurred. We can say the deepening of the food dependency and the reliance on food imports. We can see that we replaced the cash crops replaced the subsistence agriculture in Egypt. That's why we now import 50% of our need in wheat. we see that we have a high volatility of food prices each time there is a crisis or an increasing of prices on the international markets. Egypt is directly and very, very quickly impacted. We can see it on the 2008 to 2007 international crisis and agro-food system crisis. And then we had the food riots in Egypt. 2011, there was the peak of the food prices worldwide. And then we have the evolution in Egypt with the slogan of the bread. Then we can see, like I explained before, the impact of the Ukrainian war on the agro-food and the increasing prices of wheat and sunflower oil in Egypt. And we have mainly other things, aspects like food diet shifts. Mainly, we have a double burden of malnutrition, undernourishment, and overnourishment. There are 14% of all the children that are sent in Egypt, they are overweight at the same time, and it represents a little bit of 31.2% of children aged between 6 and 5 in Egypt. And we have a main degradation of biodiversity and soil fertility because the foreign capital and the other food regime, British ones and the American ones, they are imposing an intensive productivist agriculture means of production. So we have 50% of the Delta land suffers from salinity, 50% of the 3.4% of the total Arab land that we have. So it's huge. And we have also social impacts and rural and farmer impoverishment. Like I said before, we have till now 57% of our population, they are rural, and between 60 and 70% of the poverty in Egypt are very concentrated in the rural areas. So I want to go back very briefly on the global agri-food system crisis to show you that there is a very intimate relationship between the global agri-food system crisis and the recurrent crisis that's happening in our agri-food system. There is a chronic hunger. There is the manifestation of this global agri-food system crisis. It's the chronic hunger, the rural poverty, like I showed you in Egypt, the excess production. And we have a paradoxical observation that the problem, it's not the sufficiency of food on the market. The problem is the access, because most of the hunger person are farmers or in rural areas. So it has the main problem of this global agri-food system is an access to food issue. And we have the systemic nature of the crisis in the agri-food system. So in terms of response to crisis, there is two types of policies, the top-down ones and the bottom-up policies. The top-down policies, they are known as the New Liberal Action Plan. This is the market, it will automatically remedy himself and he can go out from the crisis, and it proves how it doesn't work and it's insufficient, and the market, it never auto repair himself. And the reformers action plan, it's based on the development aid, but we saw till now that the development aid, it wasn't a sufficient tool to remedy to the crisis actually in the African countries. And then there is the second option, the bottom-up policies response to the crisis. So we can see two types of action plan. The progressive one, it's like slow food and fair trade and a lot of other social justice movements. But the problem of those movements that it was accessible to the elite, and say, because it costs a little bit more on the market. So it's the elite classes that they have the awareness that can use this. And it wasn't that sufficient to, as a response to the crisis, to remedy to the crisis existence. I'm explaining all of this because what we chose in this paper was a radical action plan. It's a food sovereignty-based action plan, but we have to understand what is food sovereignty. Food sovereignty it's an alternative agri-food system, and it has its own framework, and it focuses on 6 pillars: the food for people. We will value more the food producer. They are our main priority. We will choose to localize our food system. We will put a local control upon it. We will build knowledge and skills that are farmer-based, and we will work with nature to respect the biodiversity. Then I don't want to explain the concept itself because it will take time, but if you have questions, we can go back on this one in the discussions one. So I want to present you what is happening on the food sovereignty concept. Bottom-up policies, food sovereignty was brought by Via Campesina, which is an organization. It's a civil society organization. This civil society organization is formed of like one or now 200 other association farmers and others, and they are working on institutionalization of food sovereignty. So they are bringing food sovereignty to the UN, so people and other countries, and we can create a legal framework that encompasses the food sovereignty as a concept and as a right. And then they are working, every association, they are working on the implementation at the national level of food sovereignty to create the legal and the political framework for this concept. And then we will work, the paper shows how we started to have an institutional recognition of the food sovereignty in Egypt. Because after the revolution in 2014, a new constitution was written. And in the new constitution, it was the first time in the history of Egypt that food sovereignty becomes a constitutional right of everyone, that guarantees us the protection of our agriculture, our biological diversity, and types of local plant to preserve the rights of generation and seeds in Egypt. But the problem that it was a constitutional right, it was mainly an ink on paper. So we have the legal framework, but the problem that the policies that came after this constitution, it proved that it's only written on paper, but it's not a real political choice by the government there, because we joined on 2017 the International Union for the Protection of New Varieties of Plant, the UPOV, in 2017. So we granted patent-like protection to seed breeders, and mainly what's happening, they take farmers' ancestral seeds and they transform it, they work on it to change a little bit of its specificities in laboratories, and then they patent-like those seeds, and the farmers aren't allowed anymore to use their ancestral seeds existing. We can see that we were self-sufficient in rice, and the new laws due to the hydraulic poverty now that farmers aren't allowed to cultivate rice anymore, that there is a quota and we can go beyond it. So we will be soon dependent on the international market for rice too. And I wanted to present very quickly the socioeconomic challenges of the triple sovereignty in Egypt. We have a first challenge in terms of land sovereignty. We have shrinking of arable land. We have soil erosion. We have urbanization, housing crisis. We have a problem, an issue of land grabbing, the fragmentation of agricultural holding. And the second level, it's on the challenges on the level of the seed and hydraulic sovereignty. Like I said before, the approval of the UPOV conventions on the patent lives of the seeds. And the second problem is the water poverty and the construction of a Nahda Dam in Ethiopia. So the third problem or challenge that we have, it's on the level of the food sovereignty. We have a chronic food dependency and widespread abandonment of food crops, the subsistence agriculture, and we have the double burden of malnutrition, undernourishment, and obesity. So to remedy to all this in a different and alternative agri-food system, we have main levers of action that we have to do in Egypt. We have to work an agrarian reform. We have to implement an agroecology-based policies for production, and we have to implement the Declaration of Peasant Rights that was signed by Egypt lately on 2019 at the UN level. Very quickly, the agroecology tool as an operational framework, what does it mean? It means that we reconcile the farmer practices, the ancestral farmer, their know-how, the field skills they have with the academic work and the knowledge on a local level. We use science, we use in environmental science, and we use social and sociology to work with those farmers and to put in place their know-how and to assist them on a daily basis with a more scientific and environmental policies, actually. And we have to work, agroecology framework works with social movements, the bottom-up policies, and we reorient the policies actually applied in Egypt, and we have like a full detailed programs that we can discuss later. So I don't want to be pessimistic on the results and the concluding remark of this paper. We have to know that food democracy is indispensable to have food sovereignty. And all the challenges and obstacles to achieve food sovereignty doesn't mean that it's impossible to achieve it, because we have a lot of opportunities actually existing. Egypt has agriculture in Egypt, it's still controlled by the peasant mode of production, and agricultural holdings of less than 3 acres represent 80% of the total. And we have a high rate still now of self-sufficiency and efficiency of agriculture.
Sorry, you have to close now, please.
Yes, I'll finish.
Yes.
Okay, and we have we are till now 68% self-sufficient, which is a good thing. We have to work in it and deepen it. And we have the legal framework now that helps us to integrate the right of food sovereignty and to integrate it to a real political framework. And the problem is that nothing will change without a political will to regain control locally and nationally over our agro-food system, what doesn't exist till now. Thank you very much for your attention, all of you, and sorry for being long.
Thank you. Don't worry. Well, I think all of us here agree with the importance of food dependency and food security. Now we are listening to Adriana Franco, please, she is talking about Africa and the intercapitalist dispute, resonance of Russia and Ukraine conflict. You have 20 minutes, and I am let you know when your time is over.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And well, first of all, I want to thank the Programa Universitario de Estudios sobre Asia y África for the invitation. Also, all the organizers for making this colloquium possible. My colleagues, well, with whom I share this space, and all of you who came here to listen and share some ideas with us. I also want to say something. I'm justifying myself, but I usually don't do this, but I'm gonna read my presentation My English is a little bit rushed, so with the intention to be clear and fluent, I'm gonna do that. So, as Andrea has said, the title of my presentation is Africa in the Intercapitalist Dispute, Resonances of Russo-Ukrainian Conflict. So I will start. It is February 2022. On the radio, we learned that the conflict between Russia and Ukraine has begun. We are in Bangui, the capital of Central African Republic. And while we are listening to the news on the radio, we also watch a woman placing flowers on a statue. The sculpture represents 7 bodies. One is of a woman hugging her 2 children, and the other 4 are Russian soldiers protecting them. We do not understand what is happening. While Western media claims that Russia has invaded Ukraine, Central African populations are demonstrating in the streets with banners reading, Central African Republic with Russia. How did we get to this situation? Since the conflict between Russia and Ukraine began in 2022, the dominant narrative regarding the study of the African continent has reproduced coloniality. The main speech that spread worldwide was that the African continent could face a severe famine because many of the wealth and pesticides that reached the continent were exported from the territories in conflict. According to Martin Armstrong, a data analyst, and I will quote him, Russia and Ukraine imports account for 30% of all African wheat consumption. In the case of Egypt, for example, this figure is closer to 80%. End of the quote. And although these data are accurate, the image of a catastrophe in Africa due to the war in Ukraine continues to represent the continent as an empty space without agency, and Africans as people who cannot adapt to the context they are living. Therefore, if we do not historize or contextualize, that speech will be colonial. So we need to historize and contextualize in order to understand dependency, as it has been mentioned before. Therefore, if we do, historically, subsistence agriculture has guaranteed the living of African people in the face of the structural violence of the capitalist system, even though this practice is considered unproductive from the point of view of classical economics. However, in the face of ecological crisis that we are facing, that we are experiencing nowadays, the subsistence economy is a proposal based on the care economy in order to protect life. Thinking of it in this way breaks with the linearity imposed by the system, and it could also allow us to think of a different relationship with nature, not from the human nature split of modernity, but one of relationality. By June, the war in Ukraine had generated an intense refugee crisis. According to the United Nations Refugee Agency data, by that month, there were already 4.8 million Ukrainian refugees, most of whom headed for Europe to request protection. This humanitarian situation also reflected systemic racism. The UN Refugee Agency noted that, and I quote again, European Union member states have taken unprecedented steps, rapidly activating the Temporary Protection Directive for the first time, guaranteeing access to protection and service for refugees from Ukraine. End of the quote. However, the treatment given to African refugees has been very different. With this, I do not want to say that Ukrainians should not be helped, but we should ask why it is easy to help certain bodies and not others. Even during the war, European media claimed that war was common in Africa. However, it must not have to occur in Europe. They also noted that the refugees' bodies were black, not white. These narratives strengthened the coloniality of bodies and beings, which value people based on phenotypic characteristics based on the subject of colonial capitalist modernity. That is to say, the white, bourgeois, European, heteronormative, and among other men. While these speeches were projected in Western media, Russia was establishing its presence not only in Ukraine, but also in Africa. Proof of this is the Bangui demonstrations mentioned at the beginning of the talk. At the beginning of the 21st century, the intercapitalist dispute spread throughout Africa. This confrontation implies the dispute over the direction or control of the capitalist system, not its transformation or a change in its reproduction. In Africa, governments and corporations from the United States, Russia, and China mainly are the main subjects that dispute hegemony. However, for this presentation, only the presence of the second one will be deeply analyzed. The United States began to have a more significant presence in Africa since 2003 because of the fight against terrorism. Later, in 2007, the US created a new command for the region, the United States African Command, or AFRICOM. Subsequently, they deployed small mobile military bases called lilipads and encouraged the deployment of private security forces. Likewise, they intervened directly in the territory with the operation of North Atlantic Treaty Organization in Libya, for example, and the support for the French troops in Mali. For its part, Russia also began to have a more visible presence in Africa. During the first decades of the 21st century, trade between Russia and Africa increased by 185%. The leading importers of Russia products are Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, Nigeria, Tunisia, Senegal, Sudan, and South Africa, while the main exporters are South Africa, Morocco, Egypt, Cote d'Ivoire, Tunisia, Kenya, and Ghana. Trade between Russia and the continent went from 1.5 billion in 2000 to 12.2 billion in 2014. Two-thirds of this is concentrated in North Africa, especially in Algeria and Morocco. The most important region for Russia is North Africa, because Russian government consider it to be the neighborhood of Eurasian region, and therefore central to its national security. The continent has also been represented as a fundamental space to guarantee the supply of geostrategic resources, because Russia and Africa possess nearly half of the world's biogenetic materials, fresh water, and minerals, according to Daniel and Schuben. In such a way, Russia, as the US, also represents the African continent as a repository of hegemonic fantasies. It is projected as a place without decision-making capacity, which will allow it to position itself in the intercapitalist dispute, a place of extraction. In 2011, Russia held a business forum in Ethiopia in which representatives from Mali, Niger, Sudan, Zimbabwe, and also Russian oil and gas sector participated. Russia has secured concessions for oil and gas fields in Algeria with Gazprom and Lukoil. Gazprom and Lukoil are two of the most important oil and gas companies in Algeria. So in Russia, sorry. In addition, in the Western region, Russia is planning a series of pipelines, including the one that will run from Nigeria to Algeria to transport gas from Africa to Europe. Russia also knows the importance of rare earth elements and the concentration of them on the African continent. Actually, Vasilev considered that Russia has the technology to take advantage of these resources. Once again, the continent as a space for the extraction of these resources for the benefit of the subjects that dispute the hegemony worldwide. Russia companies are also interested in uranium from the continent for developing nuclear energy. Rosatom is the leading supplier of nuclear reactors worldwide, also a Russian corporation. And although there are uranium deposits that Russia can access more quickly, such as the deposits in Kazakhstan, for example, these are insufficient for Russian corporate interests. Rosatom's nuclear reactor contracts establish that the plants will be supplied with fuel during their entire period of operation, which ranges from 50 to 60 years, more or less. For that, it's essential that Russia guarantees access to this energy, to these resources. On the other hand, since 2006, Russia has negotiated with African countries the conversion of the debt they contracted during the Soviet era. However, this action has also been accompanied by a military presence. For example, and now I quote Subir, after converting its debt to Russia in 2006, Algeria has spent 7 billion to buy Russian weapons, including new model MiG-29 jets, tanks, and other heavy weapons to enhance the capabilities of its armed forces. End of the quote. In Africa, Russia has established itself as the second arms seller in the entire continent. Actually, 13% of Russian weapons find their way to Africa. The primary recipients are Algeria, Egypt, Nigeria, and Sudan. However, between 2017 and 2018, the main ones were Algeria, Egypt, Angola, Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, Guinea, Mali, Nigeria, and Sudan. Equatorial Guinea, sorry. In addition to the arms sales, in 2015, Russia conducted a military exercise as part of the activities of its multinational joint task force. The armed forces of Cameroon, Chad, Niger, and Nigeria participated in this action. Thus, in recent years, not only has the United States been training with local forces to counter the obstacle it faces in the continent, but also Russia is strengthening its capabilities in the region. In 2016, Morocco and Russia made a joint declaration to combat transnational terrorism. Likewise, Russia has had rapprochement with the Tobruk regime in Libya, which continues without the recognition of the so-called international society. These rapprochements are not accidental, since for Russia, as I told before, North Africa is the second most important area for its security interest after Western Asia. According to the Institute for War Studies, this country has at least 21 military cooperation agreements with African countries. Also, according to Western sources, Russian mercenary forces such as Wagner, for example, are operating in Libya and Mali. The deployment of American and Russian interest in Africa is based on violence for the extraction of critical resources. This is a direct threat to the well-being of the communities. During the first anniversary of the Russo-Ukrainian War, South Africa hosted naval exercises with Russia and China. The United States and the European Union highly criticized this exercise. Still, South Africa argued that this is exclusively defensive and to improve its military and defense capabilities. The South Africa government also pointed out that on other occasions, it has carried out military exercises with Western forces because it is common to do so between countries. So the exercise with Russia and China should not represent a problem. Likewise, in recent years, both the government and the African people have rejected the continuation of Western interference, particularly the French presence. In some cases, they have even indicated that they prefer the Russian one than the Western interference. In Mali, for example, the justification for this is that the French have been making everything worse for more than 10 years. Well, if we consider the colonial period, well, it could be more years, no? But thinking about Serval operation, the implementation of Serval operation, more or less 10 years, while they consider Russian forces more effective. So the people and the government make an association between violence and the military, no, and the military forces of Russia. But they also think that those forces are more effective than the Western ones. Thus, although they do not romanticize the Russian armed forces, they prefer Russian army to counteract the instability promoted by Western intervention. In March 2023, the President of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Félix Tshisekedi, told Macron, the French president, and I quote, "Look at us differently by respecting us, by considering us as true partners, and not always with paternalistic look, with the idea of always knowing what is necessary for us." And well, I consider that the Russian presence in the continent is not an alternative to the American or French one, to the Western one, and that the intercapitalist dispute will foster war and violence in the continent. However, the approach to Russia shows the wariness of the people and also the demand for dignity. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adriana. And now we are listening to Ahmed Taher, and he's online too. So please, you can help us with the screen. Thank you. Good morning and good night. You have the floor, please. Amer?
Yes, good night.
You have
listen,
10 minutes. Yes?
You listen me? Hello? Hello?
Yes, yes, we listen to you.
Good night. You listen me?
Yes.
Welcome.
Creo que él es el que no nos escucha, ¿no?
Please, I will first thank you. Your first programs for studies and on Asia and Africa to invite me to participate this conference. I am happy to be with you. Please accept my apologies because my English is not very well, but I try to explain my idea in some points. My name is Ahmed Taher. I am the director of the Hawar Center for Political and Media Study in Egypt. And my paper is, the title of my paper is Russia-Ukraine Crisis and a Global Arms Race, Implication for Security and Development in Africa. My introduction try to confirm is that in the Russian-Ukrainian crisis promote various countries of the world to increase the volume of their military spending. The world and I depended in the report which issued from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the last report entitled Military Balance Report 2023. This report points to the change in the military balance in 2023 as some regions, such as Europe and Asia, and which resulted to increasing their military spending. On the other hand, other regions had to reduce their military spending due to high inflation and the war economic repercussion. My paper divided two parts. The first part about the map of the world military spending. I try to give a map about which countries spend more on military and defenses because the crisis give many people to research about national security. So many people give more attention to the defense policy and the military. So the reports which I depend on in this points give us some points, some indicators about which countries spend more and which countries reduce the spending on the military the spending in here in this year or in the future. The first indicators is about the increase in the European defense spending. The report referred to many European states had to increase their defense priorities. 20 states have announced in increasing in their military spending or they enhance it with the long-term spending target. And the second indicator and the second points, America and China and Russia as forefronted in the terms of their defense. In their defense budget. For example, North America accounted for approximately 40% of global defense spending, followed by Asia at the 26% and Europe at the 17%. The United States and China remained among the largest countries globally in defense budget and the military spending in 2022. The third point, inflation reduced defense spending in many regions. Global defense spending grew in normal values in 2021 and 2022, but higher inflation meant lower spending in real values in both years. In recent years, higher inflation has made a defense spending in real values in Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and so on. And the fourth point, Middle East defense spending down compared to 2021. The Middle East rank ahead in global military spending relative to GDP. We can find 7 countries in the Middle East are on the list of the largest defensive budgets relative to GDP, but with lower rates than in 2021. Saudi Arabia and Iran ranked among the top 10 countries in terms of defense budget during 2022. The outcome of this points, of this part, this means that the implication of this global trend can be monitored on the global economy in general by pointing out that this expansion in military spending has led to high inflation rates, sharp rises in commodity prices, and the supply chain crisis, which in turn led to a decline in the economic recovery witnessed by some countries after the pandemic. On the other hand, the increased defense spending in Europe in particular would have a negative impact on the global economic environment in the short term, owing to further constraints on public spending resulting from the higher cost of debt financing with higher interest rates and the energy price. This is the first part for my paper. The second part, we discuss the implication of the Russian-Ukrainian crisis for security and the development in Africa. There is no doubt that it will have a wide-ranging impact on the development of the African countries and the relevant impact on its security situation and internal stability, which can be monitored through several points as follows. The first point in this part about the political division in Africa. The African countries faced a political dilemma in determining their position on the status quo, despite the clarity of the position of African institutions on this crisis, which is calling for respect for international law, territorial and national integrity, and respect for the sovereignty of Ukraine. This is the first impact about the crisis on the countries, African countries. This faced a political dilemma, because many countries of Africa cooperate with Russia and the other cooperate with Ukraine and with France and with the United States of America. So they faced the problems, they faced dilemma how to take situation towards this crisis, although they express about their situation in respect to the international law and as I mentioned before. The second bucket, the economic repercussion related to the high levels of prices, especially food, wheat and corn, which represent both Russia and Ukraine as important source to meet the needs of these countries. The second, the security and the military repercussion and implication, and this implication are linked both to the military arrangement related to armament deals and the training, and the consequently increase in the value of the deals with one hand. Some of them stopped due to the Russian market's need for this weapon in its battle on the other hand, which may lead to an increase in burdens on the general budget of the countries the African countries, as well as a negative impact on the ability of the governments to confront terrorist organization and internal conflict. The fourth about the implications on the level of internal stability, and these implications are related to the size of the burdens that African countries will bear to provide financial resources to meet the rises in global price levels with food or military needs, which puts African government in the confrontation with citizens, which threatens social and political stability in many countries. Conclusion. In the end of my papers, I try to give short about my papers but I think that all details to the conference and put the presentation to see with me. In light of the which I mentioned before, we concluded by saying that it has become necessary for African countries to search for new approaches that enable them to rearrange the economic, political, and military priorities by seizing some of the opportunities presented by this crisis, whether it is related to the open orientation by taking advantage of the European needs for the countries for the African countries to find alternatives to energy resources. These countries, African countries also, can also benefit from the Russian need to open new horizons for cooperation with the countries of the African countries at all levels, which is the aim of confronting European and American sanctions, reducing the negative effects on the Russian economy and escaping from international isolation. I see it's a chance to the African countries to achieve some goals of their goals in economic, but dependence on the government of the African country can deal with this crisis in a new approaches, can deal with European countries and can present alternative resources to the European, especially in energy, and in the same time can deal with Russia because Russia in this time research about who can help it to decrease the sanctions about the Western sanctions on the economy, the Russian economy. So I see, so this crisis have bad or negative effects on Africa, but it have in the same time positive effects to the government of the African countries to play a new role in the world, because all researchers see this crisis will shape or help it to shape the new world system and in the future. So African countries and the Latin countries, and I see the South in general have the chance to play an important role in the world systems. In the final, I think you to listen my presentation and to invite me to participate with you in this conference. Thank you. Welcome to Egypt.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have a few minutes for questions. So someone of you have a question for the speakers? No? No one? I don't know, maybe the speakers want to say a final comment, or maybe we close the panel. You want to add something? No. Sí, now. It's time to questions. Sí, ya viene Ivana.
Well, welcome Doña Dowidar and Ahmed Taher, and also Adriana Franco. Thank you to be here in this third colloquium, framing Africa as the epicenter of the world. And I think in your, it has been very interesting to see the dispute of Africa between these imperial, I say they are imperial countries, Russia, China, and USA. I think Africa right now is very important for all the commodities that they have, especially the earth rares, and also the mines and many other minerals that are part of the future, of the economy of the future right now, the digital economy, also for the climate change. It's been that for the just in transition that we are working to have less I can say oil and all of that. But how do you see? I would like if you can make a comment. What will happen because between this conflict, this war, how do you see how will be the expectations of the countries of Africa? And also, Donia work is very interesting. How how globalization and how the insertions of country as Egypt has lost their own sovereignty in food, and also other countries has also lost their sovereignty by all the all that by the globalization process. So that will be just if you can make a comment, a very short comment. How do you see right now this dispute of Africa? Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have another question, please.
Thank you. Just a follow-up question. Can you hear me? Okay, yeah. Just a follow-up question to what Alicia was saying earlier. First question to Donia. So you mentioned the issue about the Ethiopian dam and how it affects the food security in Egypt. But I'm surprised to see that the arable land percentage increased even after the building of the dam. Can you talk a little bit about how much the construction of the dam affected access to land, affected the size of arable land, and affected availability of water for small farmers in Egypt? My second question is I think for both of you, for Adrian and Ahmed. Maybe I missed, but I did not hear you taking side to recommend what's the right direction for Africa. For example, Dr. Ahmed, you said, okay, Africa has an opportunity for either to go with Europe or to go with Russia to take advantage of the conflict. So based on your study, which side do you think is the best approach for African countries? I know there are a lot of differences among African countries, but based on your assessment, which approach is beneficial for African countries? Should they go with China/Russia side, or should they go with the European/American approach? Adrian, probably the same thing for you. You mentioned about how Russia was supporting some of the people, maybe during the socialist system, during the Cold War system. African countries benefited from that. But now there is a dilemma for them also whether to go with the European side to support Ukraine or with the Russian side because they have all these energy agreements and strategies with them. So is it possible for you to take a side and to recommend what's best for the continent? Thank you.
Thank you. I think you will answer in order to participation. So first, Donia, after Donia, Adriana, and finally, Ahmed Taher.
Okay. Thank you very much for the question. So I will thank you, Professor Alicia, for your. I will start with the comment of what you said. So I think that the loss of food sovereignty in Egypt, we can't be right now autosufficient. So I was proposing, but on another paper, that we have to be pan-African dependent instead of being Western and Occidental market dependent on food. So we have to work on our partnership with the African countries to change things, starting to relate with the question on the Ethiopian dam. I just want to say that the small increasing arable land, it comes mostly from the exploitation of the underground water in the desert. So and on another mega project that was done to take water from the Nile River to the arable land in the desert, or the reclaimed land in the desert. Why I'm talking about the risk of the Ethiopian dam and why it doesn't affect Egypt completely now, and because the second filling of the Ethiopian dam, it's not applicable yet. It didn't start yet. The huge risk and the increasing of the poverty hydraulic risk in Egypt will be in place when the filling of the second filling of the dam will start. That's why now internationally they are trying to resolve the problem, and Egypt in a diplomatic way is working on the stopping of the second filling of the dam. I hope I replied to the question, and also commented on the Professor Alicia talk intervention.
Thank you, Donna.
I'll try to answer both questions. So, but I don't know if I'm gonna succeed with that. I think that I can take aside being outside the continent, being not part of the continent, but I think that Russia is like China or Western direction is kind of the same. I think they are thinking about the continent only for the extraction of resources. They are not thinking about people. They are not thinking about the interest or the well-being of African people. So I think that it is the same. No, I don't think that there's an alternative in these proposals. That's why I think, or well, I established in the presentation that it is an intercapitalist dispute, because they are having a conflict to direct or control the capitalist system, not to change the relationship that they have with the continent, the dependency that has been created. No, they are promoting the same thing. But I think that also the demonstrations in favor of Russia or China can be understood because of all the violence and all the coloniality that has been imposed historically. No? But I think there's no, well, in that vision, there's no option in or an alternative in the proposal of these actors. So thinking about the continent, also like the continent of the future, in a capitalist point of view, I think it's problematic because we are seeing also the continent as a source of resources for the benefit of the economy. And I also think that in the crisis of, well, the ecological crisis, the alternative is not renewable energy or hybrid cars, for example. No, that's not the solution, because all the infrastructure we need to make a renewable energy or hybrid cars is based on oil energy. So there's really not an alternative in that point of view. We need to see the continent, yeah, like the continent of the future, but not because of its resources. Because of the philosophy, because of the epistemes of the people, because of what they are proposing. No? So following what Tshisekedi, the president of the Democratic Republic of Congo, said, we need to hear to African people. We need to hear their alternatives, their propositions, and make a dialogue with that in order to change the world in which we are living. That, well, I think so, but I think that.
Thank you. And finally, we are listening to Ahmed Tahar, please.
Yes, thank you for for your question, and I will complete the which my friend say before. We about how African country achieve advantages from this crisis. I see African countries can work on two tracks. The first is with the open sites by offering an alternative to Russia in the field of energy. And Africa can be also be the world's factory as an alternative to China. Also, they are difficult in this regard, but it can be benefit from the light of the Western vision to rearrange the movement of industry globally. I see the Europe and the American research rearranged the how to establish the factors in the other places instead of China. So I see African is a suitable place for the Europe and the American United States to establish factors in different industry. African country can achieve some advantage from this crisis to achieve education, to take attention from urban to give the people of the countries many attention in education, in health, and other fields. So I confirmed about two points about the European and African countries. The first for the energy instead of Russia, and the second factor of the world instead of China. This is a chance to Africa and the Latin America to achieve to benefit from this crisis. The second, on another side, with the Russian, I see also the African country can achieve some benefits from the relation between Russia and the African countries in support if can support the trade exchange between two parts, because I see the African countries is a big consumers in the world, and they can Russia present all goods, all service to the African market. This is the first point for Russia, and another Russia also can benefit from the African country in the international organization, like in the United Nations and another organization which African countries give their voice to the Russia or refused to footing against Russia. I see also in the finally, I see it is the chance to the African countries to achieve their benefits between the relation between African countries and Europe and African countries and the Russia and the China. So if the African countries put new approaches to how to deal the relation between the countries and the two sides, I think African countries will achieve many advantages, but this is difficult to African countries to achieve this, because many people, many countries in Africa don't work together. This is the first factor, and many African countries suffered from conflicted internal instability, internal, like in Sudan, like in Congo, like in Kenya, like in this is a problem. Because so I think it's the first step to achieve benefits of this crisis. We must do we should put a new approach about how African countries work together first, and the second step work with European and work to Russia. But in the fact, it's in the short term, it's difficult to prevent from this crisis. No, but we hope to achieve prevent in the longer term if the African countries can arrange the relation between the countries in the south, between the African countries, Latin countries, and some countries, another countries who suffered from this crisis, and which refused to pace or compromise with Ukraine, with Russia, or with the United States. Thank you.
There is a problem with internet, so they are not online anymore. It went off. It isn't live anymore, so they can't hear us anymore.
Is it for me?
Yes, and I'm just trying to tell you that they had a problem with internet, so they can't hear us anymore. So we are in the Zoom together, but in Mexico City, they can't hear us anymore.
You don't listen me. So I will turn again to speak. You don't listen me before?
I heard you, but the room in Mexico, they didn't hear you because the internet is, but they have an issue with internet.
Yes. Thank you.
So no worries. I think we will go out. I think they will finish, they will close the session. I received the message, they will close the session, and they are thanking all of you for your presence on this panel.
Thank you.
Okay.
Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
It was a pleasure. Yeah.
Pleasure to with you today. Thank you again.
Thank you. Bye.